This is the second video which I have uploaded, all about Tony Harrison's political and social protest poetry. In this video I'll be looking at the poem National Trust, and this video is aimed specifically at students studying A-level English literature, the political and social protest module, but it of course can be useful for anyone who is perhaps studying Harrison as part of their qualification. This is one of the shorter poems in the collection that A-level students look at least. And central to this poem are two metaphors which presents how the speaker feels, and by definition it's assumed, therefore Harrison, about how the working class have been marginalised in history because of being rendered voiceless. So the first metaphor is anecdotal evidence of a convict being lowered down a mining shaft by the ruling elite or the establishment to see how deep the shaft is, and they did it as well as part of a bet. And due to this trauma, the convict was unable to speak about it afterwards. The second metaphor is in reference to a tin mine in Cornwall, and the speaker in the second half of the poem ponders how the miners would have spoken in Cornish, which would be a minority language in Britain, and a language which has been arguably suppressed by the ruling class and the desire that everybody speaks English. The speaker also labels himself a scholar, as if he is suggesting that he is prepared to speak out against injustice and those that are seen on the lower rungs of the social ladder, such as the working class. And this poem is also really about language and how language is very closely tied up to our identity. So at the end of this video I'll be talking about that in terms of a way to interpret the significance of this poem. The title of the poem has two interpretations. There's a literal connotation or interpretation of the poem and a metaphorical one. So some of you might have heard of the National Trust, which is a well-known and respected organisation which cares for a wide array of historical buildings, landscapes and gardens which are regarded as having national significance. I think this applies to Northern Ireland, England and Wales. Scotland has its own similar organisation. And the National Trust manages to maintain all of these things through the subscription of its members who can visit these locations. And one of the locations that the National Trust looks after is the shaft pumping engine in Cornwall. Apologies for my pronunciation, but I would pronounce that Toenroth, but apologies if I am completely wrong in my pronunciation. The more literal connotation or literal interpretation of the title is more to do with the abstract idea of trust. The poem alluding to the lack of trust, in fact, between the different classes in British society. So there's an ironic edge to this title, perhaps. So between the working class and the elite, those in power and privilege. So in this poem, the middle class could be seen as exploiting the working class, rendering them silent and powerless by them. So, as is the case often with Harrison, particularly in the political and social protest collection, there's going to be a class comment here, and this poem perhaps is no different. And we've got the Cornish flag there on the left, the black background with the white cross, and just a simple diagram there of a mine and the shaft running from the house there on top of the hill right down to the bottom, and that is effectively what Harrison is using as a metaphor in this poem. So let's look at how this poem begins. The poem begins by the speaker saying, bottomless pits. There's one in Castleton, and stout upholders of our law and order one day thought its depth worth wagering on, and borrowed a convict hush-hush from its warder, and winched him down, and back, flayed, grey, mad, dumb. So the poem begins with a minor sentence. It's a minor sentence because there's no verb in that first sentence there. And this suggests, of course, it helps us understand straight away the subject of this poem, which is to do with mining. But it also suggests that there is a more emotional, metaphorical sense here. For example, we might use the idiom now, the pit of despair, and this is clearly not a poem that you'd read for comedy purposes. It also suggests that the speaker has been thinking about this for some time, and he is now using the setting of the mines in order to act as a springboard for talking about something which is more endemic in society, such as a class divide or even class war. So the speaker is now ready to expand or explore his thoughts in more detail. Castleton is in the Peak District in Derbyshire, and there is obviously, because it's a mine, it has cavernous depths, and the depth could be seen as a metaphor for the large divide between the powerful elite and the powerless, in brackets, working class. There is an ironic interpretation here of the stout upholders of our law and order, meaning the elite, considering what they do with the convict in the second bit of this stanza. For example, the speaker is suggesting they're not that honourable, they're not that moral. So how have they earned that position of being stout upholders? Clearly, Harrison or the speaker does not believe that. It's an ironic criticism there. We don't really know when this was. We just get told one day. So in terms of time, it's quite vague. But I think we are to assume that it is the recent past, perhaps in the last century, perhaps. And a wager is a form of bet. So these elite people are lowering a convict down the shaft of this mine in order to understand the depth of it, and they're betting on it. And I think there's something quite emotive here. So the convict, of course, is still a human being with feelings, but the verb borrowed suggests that the convict has been objectified or dehumanized, as if it's a commodity, as if he's a commodity. And a degree of callousness there. And hush hush suggests a degree of conspiracy, injustice and secrecy. For example, who is going to stick up for this convict? Who is on the convict's side protecting him from this treatment? Of course, the answer is nobody. So these people get away with it because of their power. And you have an asyndetic list here of adjectives, which just enhances that emotive depiction of the convict after he was lowered down this mine. You've got flayed, which means the skin was kind of grazed here, because the skin was rubbing against the cavernous walls. His hair turned grey from fright and shock, and he's also described as mad and dumb, meaning, I suppose, mad with frenzy, but also dumb, meaning unable to speak. And that reminds me of the poem marked with D, this idea of not being able to articulate yourself because of a particular trauma and not being able to express yourself. So as explained earlier, this act of lowering a man down a hole is one of the ways in which Harrison looks at this class divide, this huge divide between those at the top and those at the bottom, literally as well as figuratively in terms of the class system in society. As we move on to the next section of the poem, we have the exclamative sentence, "Not even a good flogging made him holler." So suggesting that the convict was flogged or whipped, but he still remained silent. So there is a huge focus here on voicelessness, and which is indicative of a common theme for Harrison, which is the idea of not being able to articulate yourself and a voice not being heard because of the class in which the convict came from in society. And this is not just the case. Then the voicelessness of the working class or the lower classes could also be seen as a problem now. As we move into that second kind of main section here, it begins with "O gentlemen," meaning that the speaker is addressing the same establishment figures from the past. A better way to plumb the depths of Britain's dangling a scholar, say, here at the bottom shaft at Towernoth, the now National Trust, a place where they got tin, those gentlemen who silenced the men's oath and killed the language they were sworn in. So here we have the idea of plumbing the depths, the idea of, I'm going to say in the olden days, not very scientific or precise, but in the past, people would have tied a lead weight to a piece of string or rope and let it drop to the bottom of the ocean to see how deep it was. So it's again this idea of people at the top and people at the bottom, or something at the bottom. And again, this could be now seen as idiomatic in terms of somebody says that she plumbed the depths of despair. So it's again to do with idioms nowadays in terms of how we would express our feelings. And this idea, this image of using a weight in the ocean caters to three interpretations. First, it links back to the physical depth of the Castleton mine with the convict. It talks about human misery, and it also talks about gauging the social divide in British society and the disparities between those who have and those who have not. So it caters to three interpretations there. We have the specific place in Cornwall, the tin mine in Cornwall, and the shaft is again symbolic of that metaphorical depth between classes. And you have this kind of emotive idea of the language being killed, so the Cornish language being killed by the elite. The English ruling class is responsible for erasing the language and therefore identity. The verb killed is quite emotive, and it suggests that the language is being personified here. In other words, to snub out somebody's identity. And of course, we would call Cornish perhaps now a minority language, the same with Welsh or Gaelic, because English is kind of taken over. And in this stanza as well, the speaker labels himself a scholar, suggesting he's educated and articulate, aware of the injustices that have happened, and willing to speak out against any injustice which the convict and others in these mines might not have been able to have on their side, this power of language. So again, it links this idea of poetry being a powerful tool, or literature being a powerful tool in the quest for justice and fairness. We'll talk about that at the end of this presentation as well. And then finally, the end of the poem, there's a lot of kind of sayings here. The speaker says, "The dumb go down in history and disappear, and not one gentleman's been brought to book." So gentlemen again mock respect. This is to do with the elite who are responsible for creating this class disparity. And again, it links to this idea of the suppression of language and therefore culture and identity in itself, but also being seen as a widespread class war, seen as deliberate marginalisation of the elite, removing the tongue from which the working class can articulate their needs and demands. So if you, in effect, gag somebody, they're not going to be able to talk, and therefore they're going to be dumb in this sense, meaning denied a voice. And as a result of that, because they're not going to be able to articulate their voice and their thoughts, it means that they're going to suffer the consequences of that silence. The idea here, of course, is if you've got history, the idea is the victims and the underclass are left out of recorded history. And the question I think that I always ask students is, to what extent is history controlled by the elite? To what extent is our history about the powerful? To what extent does history look at the lower class, for example, or is it all about the rich and the victors and the people that won something or were powerful? And it perhaps also alludes to this idea that the elite are determined to cling on to their higher status because they don't want the inferior people to suppress their power their wealth or privilege. So they feel the need to suppress the inferior groups in order to hang on to their higher status. So history, you could say, is arguably censored to focus on the elite and the wealthy and the powerful just by, our history books. And brought to book can mean two things. It can be held accountable, facing punishment for what you've done. But it can also mean here, I think, brought to book as in not going in history books because it's been erased. So erased from history because of the oppression of the ruling class, and therefore the ruling class are not going to be brought to history books, for example. They have been effectively censored. And we finish off with the Cornish version and the English translation of a saying, which means what happens to those who can't defend their interests. The tongueless man gets his land took. In other words, if you are rendered speechless and you have no voice, you're going to be overthrown, you're going to be rendered powerless, and you're going to have your land taken away from you. If that land is your power, then you're not going to be able to defend yourself, and you're going to lose your livelihood, that kind of idea. So that's given in both Cornish and English, and I think, of course, it's significant that it's given there in Cornish in italics, because, of course, Harrison is using his intellect. He's also using the power of the pen and the poem to reinforce a minority language. In this poem, it's not just English that's being used. There's also a foregrounding here of a minority language, representative perhaps of that minority class, such as those miners in the tin mine. So that's how the poem finishes. Just a couple more slides to do with how you might want to interpret some key themes here. So, typical of Harrison, you have the power of language and speech. So, the silencing of a class, as seen as in other poems. The role or job of a writer or poet to use their writing to give a voice to those who have been sidelined or silenced. So, the pen, therefore, as a tool of protest. The poem or the pen or the page, literature, being used as a way to communicate anger or indignation about a social injustice. So here it would be the exploitation and marginalisation of the working class by the elite. And again, that word elite, I put in kind of inverted commas here because that can, include lots of different people from lots of different institutions. Something that I would encourage you to do is to look at all of the poems in your A-level course or the Harrison collection more generally, and look at all the semantics which are to do with language and speech. So you have hush hush, dumb, holler, silenced, oath, language, swore, tongueless. Lots of words, semantic filled there to do with speech and language, because clearly this is a central concern, because it's to do with the suppression of voice and identity by the ruling class to cling on to their power and suppress working men and women. Think of the poem marked with D, for example, how the father in that poem was unable to articulate himself. And again, it's to do with language and how languages are really, I think, our only way in which we can defend ourselves. So think of the power of language and speech in Harrison as a central theme. Finally, just to carry on with that, the idea of minority language. Of course, Harrison is a more contemporary poet than what we're used to in English literature. And a minority language is very much to do with your identity. So when asked about the decline of minority languages such as Gaelic or Welsh or Cornish, Harrison said this in 1998. He says, "It seems to me that in the destruction of that diversity we lose something incredibly important. Not only names for flora and fauna, I should say, but different ways of naming the world. It's incredibly important to preserve person and people's identities which are rooted in the language they speak, the way they speak, the way they have observed nature and the world. It's an incredibly complicated system, and destroying it is barbaric. Lack of national trust is what destroys language. So he said that in 1998, and that is from the English and Media Centre. So conveniently for us, as scholars of Harrison here, to understand what he says gives us a really good and key insight into how to interpret these poems, because we have the man himself explaining what was the catalyst perhaps for these poems, and linking to the title there, that ironic use of the title, the lack of national trust, which destroys language and creates this class disparity. And finally, in terms of the relevance of this poem, of course, literature is often studied because it's relevant. It tells us about who we are today and who we were, and perhaps who we also want to be in the future. Literature is a form of history in itself. And think about what similar stories are in the news recently in terms of languages. For example, I've heard recently how there's a debate going on in terms of Welsh being compulsory in Welsh schools as a language in order to preserve it, because the danger is, of course, that we will lose these languages over time if English takes over. So to what extent this poem is relevant because of this theme of having to foreground these minority languages in order to keep hold of the heritage and the people's identity of them. And I think there are still many people who speak these languages as well in the UK, but they're not well known because English has taken over. So clearly finishing the poem with the Cornish saying therefore has significance. It's a way of preserving that identity and sticking up for the minority and their language. So that is the poem National Trust. I hope that was useful for the Political and Social Protest module, or indeed anybody who was studying this poem for any other courses. Thank you.